Morning, members. I call Committee of the Whole on Bill 38, Indigenous Self-Government and Child and Family Services Amendment Act to order, and we are on Clause 32.
I'm not sure what the...
Member?
Sorry, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to...
Member for Vancouver-Langara.
On Clause 32?
That is correct.
Okay. So on Clause 32, it does give us another opportunity, Madam Chair, to have this discussion that we've been having about jurisdiction and how the director steps in. This area here relating to continuing custody orders, here again, we have the opportunity for the director to apply to court under 50.03 sub 2 for an order that the continuing custody order be maintained on the basis that the Indigenous law referred to in the notice that was provided in accordance with 50 sub 0.02 sub 3 a sub a does not apply to the child. So this is the third example provision in this act for which the minister yesterday confirmed that these are, I'm sure, and I will invite her to comment again in this area of continuing custody orders, that they are rare in nature for where the director may make an application to court to that the Indigenous law does not apply to the child. But in doing so, I'd asked the minister to comment and recap some of the ways that this fits together. I was referring yesterday to some of the discussion around Indigenous law and what the minister confirmed, that it is being codified by various Indigenous governing bodies, including the ones that are currently in the coordination tables with the federal and provincial governments here, and that there was work going on. I was focused in some ways on Part 1.1, the self-government principles, and the ways in which the director providing services under the Act must do so in a manner consistent with the Indigenous law, where it's provided in writing to the director, or if not provided in writing to the director, it is in accordance with an agreement. We confirmed yesterday with the minister that that agreement would be a coordination agreement or a Section 6 or Section 7 agreement. So presumably in this case, and in the other two examples we looked at yesterday, where a director can apply to a court, in this instance, to say that the Indigenous law does not apply to the child insofar as continuing custody orders, that must mean, and I'd like the minister to confirm this, that it's in an area where the Indigenous law has not been at least agreed to by the director, meaning it's not the subject matter of an agreement, which means it is an Indigenous law that has been recognized here in the sense that it exists and governs in this area, and yet the director is challenging the applicability of the law. The minister yesterday again confirmed that it is not assessing the law itself, but it is, in this case, saying to the court of this province that it doesn't apply to the child. So again, I need to continue to ask this question because we need clarity around where these provisions work and how they will work. Because this is an area, again, to check with the minister that applies where there's no agreement. Because if there was an agreement, the director wouldn't be applying to court to say it doesn't apply to the child or a child of that nation. So I am asking through you, Madam Chair, to the minister to please clarify in what instance will this occur, on what grounds will the director be applying for a court order that Indigenous law does not apply to the child.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So the focus needs to be on the child, and so what's really important is the identification of whether that IGB, that Indigenous governing body, has jurisdiction over the child. It is very, very, very unlikely that the Ministry would disagree, because the definition of an Indigenous child and their membership of a community is very inclusive.
Member.
So again, the minister's limiting the scope of this provision as only a determination by the director in the very rare situation where it's viewed by the director that that the Indigenous law that's being presented doesn't apply to the child. And that strictly on the grounds that the child is not a member of the nation for which that Indigenous law is being presented as. Is that correct?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So it could be that circumstance, but we don't know what other circumstances may be presented. It's about whether or not the law applies to the child.
Member.
Okay, so we now have gone through a few scenarios right now, and the minister now has acknowledged that there could be other circumstances beyond the identity of the child as Indigenous. That there could be other circumstances where it's viewed by the director that the Indigenous law does not apply to the director to the child, which is my original question, and actually dates back to the two other scenarios that we've covered under the other provisions of this act, where a director is applying to a court in British Columbia to suggest or for a court order that the Indigenous law does not apply to the child. So in the first instance, when we asked this question yesterday, we had an understanding that it had to do with the identity of the child. Now we're talking about other circumstances, which is what I'm trying to get clarity on. And I'd ask again through you, Madam Chair, what are the other circumstances where this may arise?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. When Indigenous jurisdiction is being exercised, then Indigenous law prevails. So it is only in the circumstance where the Indigenous law does not apply to the child. And we cannot think, we don't have lots of it, we don't have examples of where that might apply.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the minister's response in the sense that she has clearly there's a contemplation that there may be other circumstances, but the minister cannot at this time define what those circumstances may well be. Another way to approach this question, which does something that is relevant to clause 30. That we looked at yesterday, I mean, under this clause, Madam Chair, in section 50 sub .05 sub 1, there's change of circumstances, continuing custody order. That's the title. I will say that we didn't have the opportunity to review the similar wording, just noting for the record, for those who might look back at this, change of circumstances, withdrawal after presentation hearing. There is a similar lead-in language where here, an Indigenous authority may apply to the court for an order that Indigenous law applies to an Indigenous child if circumstances have changed significantly since an order was made in relation to the child. So with this mechanism, which I would say, to the extent that this is a rare instance that the ministry views is applicable, there are pages of this bill that go through various scenarios that the ministry cannot describe as to how this applies. So the complexity of the legal regime that we are placing on nations to work through their laws in order to reassert their Indigenous laws as it stands for taking care of their own children is complex. This is the solution of this government, is to add additional complexity on top of nations and those working within the system. So I'm just trying to get clarity in the very little time that I have at this juncture now, on the last day of session, before closure is brought by this government, to limit debate. We've been under time pressures on this bill. We're working through the bill to the best of our abilities, and I appreciate the minister and the staff around her who have been very patient trying to address the complexity of this bill. But I am concerned that we're not doing enough justice in many ways to the clarity that's required under this bill. So with that in mind, I will just ask the question then. Here we have a situation the Indigenous Authority can apply to court for a further order to say the circumstances that we cannot define, and I asked the minister to try and define these circumstances then, where they've changed, such that the order that was made originally does now apply to the child. So can the minister now walk us through these particular circumstances that are contemplated under 50.05 sub 1?
Minister.
So all of these provisions are to ensure that the director, so the director with the provincial government can vacate the space when an Indigenous law applies. And Indigenous law applies when the Indigenous governing body is exercising jurisdiction. And an IGB has jurisdiction when the child is a member of their community. The CFCSA has many detailed processes, all of which need to be addressed in order to ensure that the director is able to vacate the space in that situation.
Member.
Yes, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that that is a good summary of some of this bill and the structure of the bill. But what we're into now, though, is situations where the director is challenging the applicability of the Indigenous law to the child. And so we went through that a couple of different ways now. But then coming back, we have the Indigenous Authority now applying to court again. After 50.03 sub 8 sub A contemplates a situation where the court orders that the child remains in the custody of the director under the continuing custody order and that the continuing custody order be maintained. This is in response to an application by the director that the Indigenous law does not apply to the child. So now we have in response the Indigenous Authority applying back to the court after the court has already ordered that the director is correct. The director's application that the Indigenous law does not apply to the child is correct. The court agrees with the director. We have set up a system now where the care of Indigenous children have to go to court for the court to determine in situations where the director believes that the Indigenous law does not apply to the child. And again, I've invited the minister to give clarity on the situations where the director would make that application. We have some clarity, but not complete clarity. Now I'm asking, Madam Chair, as to when the Indigenous Authority needs to go to court because circumstances have changed significantly since that original order made by the court agreeing with the director that the Indigenous law doesn't apply. Now, the Indigenous Authority comes back to court and says, well, that Indigenous law does apply to the child now because circumstances have changed significantly. So I'm asking these questions only for clarity for everyone involved, including the Indigenous governing bodies. What do these words mean? What does it contemplate? Where Indigenous Authority can go back to court to apply where circumstances have changed significantly.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. All of these provisions apply to children and youth who are currently in the system on continuing care orders. And so this is the mechanism for the director to vacate the space when Indigenous law applies.
Member.
So children who are in the system, director can vacate the space where Indigenous law applies. So director, in some cases where a child is in the system, applies to court to say that the Indigenous law doesn't apply to this child. That's what the previous provision under 50.03 sub 1 provides. Is that correct?
Minister.
It's subsection 2, and that only applies in situations where the director thinks that the Indigenous law does not apply to that child.
Member.
Right. So that means it's a situation where as much as the minister said, this is what we're trying to do is have the director vacate where Indigenous law does apply. Here in a situation is where the director believes and applies to court to say that the Indigenous law does not apply. The court order is granted, and the Indigenous authority comes back in to say it does apply, where circumstances have changed significantly. Again, through you, Madam Chair, to the minister, on what grounds, what is the test, what are the circumstances that this provision, which is section 50.05 sub 1, second line on page 26 of the bill, what does that mean?
Minister.
Section 50.03 subsection 8 identifies that it is the court that will consider the application of the Indigenous law to the child and will determine either that the Indigenous law applies or that the Indigenous law does not apply.
Member.
Yes, that certainly is what sub 8 sets out. But we're talking here about the legislation. This is what we do in this House, is we have the opportunity to review the actual proposed legislation to change the system. And this is the guidance that we're providing, the legislative framework for which courts interpret and apply the law. So this minister and this government is presenting a bill to this House that provides a legislative framework that the courts need to interpret. So I'm asking the minister, through you, Madam Chair, what is the circumstances that are contemplated by this provision where the Indigenous authority can go back and apply where there's significant changes in the circumstances? What is that actually referring to?
So 50.03 subsection 8 identifies that the court considers all of the application to identify whether the Indigenous law applies to the child. And even if the provincial court finds that an Indigenous law does not apply to the child, the Indigenous authority still has an opportunity to have the issue reconsidered by the court based on a significant change in circumstances. That could be, a change in circumstances is dependent upon the specific situation and circumstances relating to that child. And it could also be a change in the Indigenous law.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And that actually does provide some additional clarity as to how the ministry contemplates this process and the legal proceedings in the courts. It does suggest, though, as well, that we're asking the courts to review the Indigenous law itself, that there's something there that the courts, and I would ask then that the minister confirm that, as the minister has said yesterday, there is no review done by government when an Indigenous law is presented to government to assume jurisdiction, and yet the courts are going to be asked to review that Indigenous law in terms of its applicability to the child. Is that correct?
Minister.
The court isn't reviewing the law. The court is reviewing the application of the law to that child. And this is only going into the court system after every other approach to dispute resolution has been exhausted.
Shall clause 32 pass? So ordered. Shall clause 33 pass? So ordered. Shall clause 34 pass? So ordered. Shall clause 35 pass? Member from West Vancouver, Capilano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So clause 35, we're adding 50.2, dispensing with consent of an Indigenous governing body. This is providing for the ability for the provincial court to, making an application for the provincial court to dispense with required consent of an Indigenous governing body before a director requests the placement of an Indigenous child for adoption. So my question to start is through the chair to the minister. Can the minister confirm if a child over 12 chooses to be adopted, the consent of the Indigenous governing body is not required?
Minister.
No, consent of the IGB is required, and this provision would only be used when there's a dispute.
Member.
Thank you to the minister. I am confused then by the wording in this 50.21. On application from a director or a child who is 12 years of age or older, the court may, in the child's best interest, dispense with the consent required under section 50.12D. So is that not saying that it can dispense with the consent of the Indigenous governing body?
Member.
The court is able to do that.
Just one question.
Recognizing the member from Vancouver Langara.
Just one question for clarity. Where is section 50.12 sub D?
Members. Minister.
Thank you. Could the member please clarify the question?
Member.
Just to assist the minister and her team, the reference in 50.2 sub 1, which my colleague, the member from West Vancouver Capellan, was just referring to, refers to the section 50.1 sub 2 sub D. That section is not under the existing legislation that I have in front of me for this act. I wonder whether that is a misreference and should actually be section 50.2 sub 1 sub D, which refers to sub D of this Bill 38.
Minister.
It's added in clause 34. Chair, I move that the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
Members, you've heard the question, that this committee rise and report progress on Bill 38 and ask leave to sit again. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. This committee stands adjourned.